Good day po, my name is Rajan Alimon and the subject that I will tackle is all about share-based payments. So, what is a share-based payment? So, according po sa ating module, a share-based payment is a transaction in which the entity receives goods or services as a consideration for equity instrument of the entity, including shares or share options, or acquired goods or services for amount that are based on the price of the entity's shares or the other equity instrument of the entity. Ang share-based payment po is a transaction which the entity receive goods or services from the suppliers, including po their employees, in a share-based procedure. The accounting requirement for the share-based payment depend on how the transaction will be settled, whether in a form of equity settled or the cash settled. Tinawag po itong share-based payment kasi po normally this is based on the fair value of the shares of the company. Tinatawag din po itong performance-based compensation kasi nga nakasalalay sa performance ng mga employees kung tataas ba ang net income or not ng company. Dahil kung mataas ang net income, syempre mataas din yung fair value of shares. At kung mataas yung fair value of shares, ay syempre mataas yung matatanggap nilang share-based payment. Yun po yung share-based payment. Share-based payment is also an agreement between the entity and the other party that entitles the other party to receive either in the form of cash or other asset that is based on the price of the entity's equity instruments. So, there are three types of share-based payment transaction. So, number one po is yung equity settled. So, in this element po, the supplier or the other party will be paid by equity instrument of the entity, including share or share option. This is also a common way to reward some working employees in some big companies. Yun nga po, yung mga ibang companies, lalo na po yung mga malalaki, ang binibigay po nilang reward sa kanilang mga employees ay yung share options. So, mamaya po is i-discuss ko po kung ano nga ba po ba yung share options. So, number 2 naman po is yung cash settled. So, in this element naman po, the supplier gets paid for their goods and services by a cash, but the amount of the cash is depende po sa entity's equity instrument value or price. Yung dito naman po sa cash settled, yung ibinabayad naman po sa goods and services po ng other party or the suppliers is cash po. But depende po sa entity's equity instrument value or price po. So, number 3 naman po is the share-based payment with cash alternatives. So, in this element naman po, yung terms of agreement provide the counterparty you will decide whether the entity settle the transaction by cash or by issuing equity instrument. So, dito naman po sa share-based payment with cash alternatives, yung counterparty po yung mag-decide kung yung pagsisettle ba is in a form of cash settled or sa equity settled. Ito pong mga share-based payment transaction is possible po siya na magkaroon po sila ng vesting conditions or period, depende po sa company, depende po sa entity. And after or in the end of that vesting period, doon lang po sila magiging entitled doon sa share-based payment. Share option or stock option. This contract gives the holder the right but not the obligation to subscribe to the entity's share at a fixed or determinable price for a specified period of time. So, most of the big companies po, lalo na po yung mga private companies, yung binibigay po nilang reward or kinocompensate po nila yung kanilang employees for their hard work in the form of salary and stock option. For illustration po, para po magets po natin yung, para po malinawan po tayo ng konti sa stock option is, for example po, si employee ay nabigyan ng 50,000 shares, which is, let's just say, 2% po ng company. So, syempre po assets yon. So, he needs to pay for its tax. hindi naman po agad-agad na makakash out ito, so parang liability pa rin po yon para sa kanya. So, instead po of giving him those shares, the company give him stock option, the option to purchase those shares in a specified price. So, let's say po ang price per share that time is, nung binigay po sa kanya yung stock option ay 1 peso. Then, after 5 years naman po, yung price niya po is nag-increase po into 7 pesos. So, in this time po, na nag-increase na po yung price po per share is, napagplanuhan po ni employee A na exercise yung kanyang stock option. So, imbis na 7 pesos per share, which is 350,000 pesos ang babayad niya, ay magiging 50,000 pesos lang. Kasi nga, dahil dun sa stock option niya 5 years ago. And, pag ibebenta niya naman, kapag napagplanuhan niya namang ibenta yung share na yon is, and the buyer is agreed to pay 7 pesos per share, so yung per share, so yung 6 pesos per share, ayun na yung magiging margin ni employee A. Parang yun na yung kinita niya doon sa stock option na yon. And most of the stock options are subjected on a vesting conditions. So, for example po, ng vesting condition is, si Rigel ay employee ng isang private company and subjected po siya for a stock option. And the company give a vesting condition that he will only have an access dun sa stock option if he stays in the company in a certain amount of time. So, ganoon po yung vesting example po ng vesting conditions. Yung company po yung nagbibigay nun dun sa employee ng vesting condition para po ma-access niya yung stock option na ibibigay sa kanya. And mostly po sa mga stock option ay na-expire din po siya after 10 years or 1 to 3 months after employee leaves the company. Kaya dapat dun sa time na yun is pumili na yung employee kung ikikip niya ba yung stock option or ibebenta niya. So, depende pa rin po yun sa company policy. In accordance po with the paragraph 7 of PFRS 2, an entity shall recognize the goods or services received or acquired in a share-based payment transaction when the entity obtains the good or as the services are received. So, how will the entity recognize the share-based payment transaction? So, first, syempre, the entity should consider when to recognize a share-based payment transaction. So, based dun sa paragraph 7 of PFRS 2, the entity shall recognize good received when they are delivered or obtained by the entity, and for the services naman po is shall recognize when it is delivered or incurred. So, paano nga i-recognize ang share-based payment transaction? So, number 1 is the equity-settled share-based payment transaction. If the transaction is in equity-settled, recognize a corresponding increase in equity if the goods or services were received. So, ang example po nito is when the entity acquire goods or services from the suppliers including their employees and pays for it in a form of entity's equity instrument such as share or share options. So, dito po sa equity-settled share-based payment transaction is we will debit assets or expenses and we will credit an equity account kasi nga equity settled siya, kaya equity account ang ating i-record sa credit side. So, number 2 naman po is the cash settled share-based payment transaction. If the transaction is when the entity pays in cash based on the price of the equity instrument, a liability will be recognized if goods or services were acquired. So, dito naman po, we will debit pa rin ng assets or expenses. And sa credit side naman po, ang ilalagay po natin ay liability account. So, ang pinagkaiba po nung equity settled share-based payment transaction and cash settled share-based payment transaction ay ang equity settled, ang i-record po sa credit side ay yung equity account. And sa cash settled naman ay yung liability account kapag ang goods services is na-receive na or na-delivered na. So, parehas lang sila sa debit side ng assets or expenses account ang i-record. And when the goods or services received or acquired in a share-based payment transaction is not qualified as an asset. Kung hindi po siya qualified na asset, then i-recognize po natin siya as expenses. Cash settled share-based payment transaction. So, the entity shall measure the goods or services acquired and the liability incurred at the fair value of the liability. And until the liability is settled, the entity shall remeasure the fair value of the liability at the end of each reporting period and the date of settlement, with any changes in fair value recognized in the profit or loss for the period. So, this cash settled transaction, so the credit side will be liability account and not an equity account. Katulad po ng sinabi ko kanina, this liability will be measured based on its fair value. And the liability, this liability is mariremeasure siya sa each reporting period until masettle iyon. And any increase or decrease on the fair value of that liability will be recognized in a profit or loss for that period. Share-based payments with cash alternatives. So dito po yung yung counterparty po yung may choice ng settlement. So, number 1 po is continue to recognize the original fair value of the instrument in the normal way. Dito po, continuous lang po yung pag-recognize ng original fair value ng certain instrument, whether cash settled or equity settled. The entity need to separate liability and equity instrument in accordance with the requirements for cash and equity settled share-based payment respectively. So, sa number 2 naman po, recognize the liability to settle in cash at the modification date based on the fair value of the shares at modification date and extent to which the specified services have been received. So, dito po, nire-recognize po yung liability that will be settled in cash at the modification or settlement date based on the fair value of the shares during that period, and also the fair value of the goods or services in the date it was received. So, number 3 naman po, remeasure the fair value of the liability at each reporting date and at the end of the date and at the date of the settlement, which any changes in fair value recognized in profit or loss of the period. So, dito naman po sa remeasure na ito is the liability will be remeasured at each reporting date until it is settled. Until it is settled, any increase or decrease sa fair value po ng liability will be recognized sa profit or loss for that period. Number 4 naman po is balance of equity components should be the excess of original fair value of the equity instrument, date of grant minus fair value of the cash alternative, date of modification, number of share option, the extent to which the specified services have been received. So, the balance or the total amount of equity components is equivalent or binubuo po ng mga fair value of the equity instrument, fair value on the date of grant minus the fair value of the cash alternative, date of modification such as settlement po or cancellation, number of share options, and the fair value po ng goods or services at the date it was received. So, doon po na pumapaikot yung share-based payment with cash alternatives, and dito na po natatapos ang aking report. And sana po may natutunan po kayo kahit konti. And thank you po sa pakikinig.